The solicitor had been speaking for nearly 20 minutes before anyone in the room thought to close the door against the cold. Miriam Calder noticed it. She noticed most things in this room that no one else noticed. The untouched tray of biscuits, growing stiff at the corner of the mahogany sideboard, the way the second footman kept his gaze precisely at the level of the carpet, the fire that had not been adequately banked and was now spitting low and reluctant in the grate. She noticed these things because noticing was her occupation. 3 years as secretary and correspondent to the late Lord Ashwick had sharpened her attention into something she could no longer turn off, even on a morning like this, when she had no practical reason to attend to anything at all. She was not, strictly speaking, supposed to be here. Mr. B. Hartley, the family solicitor, had summoned the household to the great drawing-room of Ashwick Hall at 10 o'clock on the 14th of November, in the year of our Lord 1811, for the formal reading of the will of Edmund Carow, 5th Baron Ashwick, who had died of a fever 6 weeks prior. The family occupied the gilded chairs nearest the fire. The housekeeper, Mrs. Peel, stood at the back left. The 2 senior footmen stood at the door. Miriam had placed herself against the far wall just inside the room in case she was needed, and at enough remove from the family that she could not be accused of presuming. Presuming was the word Lady Constance Ashwick had used in November of last year, when Miriam had addressed a remark about the estate ledgers directly to the late Baron, rather than routing it through his heir apparent. Lady Constance was the Baron's younger sister, and she had used that word with the particular precision of a woman who had spent 63 years practicing it. She was using her fan now, which was notable given the cold. The fan moved in small, controlled arcs at her wrist, and her eyes rested on Mr. Hartley, with an expression of patient certainty that Miriam had learned to read as appetite. The will was straightforward, Mr. Hartley explained. The unentailed properties and the personal effects had been divided among the female relatives by name. There were modest bequests to the servants of long standing. The baronetcy itself, and the entailed lands of Ashwick, comprising the Hall, the home farm, the 3 tenanted farms of Marin, Colwick, and Drenby Fields, and all income thereunto pertaining, would pass in accordance with the standard terms of the entail. To the nearest male heir, Lady Constance's fan slowed. "As your ladyship is aware, Mr. Bract," Hartley said, adjusting his spectacles with the air of a man about to say something he had carefully rehearsed, "that designation falls at present to Mr. Gerald Carow, cousin to the late Baron, residing at present in Bath." A small sound moved through the room. Not a murmur, precisely. More, the quality of air shifting, collective and involuntary, the way a room changes when a verdict lands. Gerald Carow sat to the left of the empty chair that had been the late Baron's. He was 41 years old, broad across the jaw, and narrow across the conscience, and Miriam had met him twice. Once at the Baron's name-day dinner 3 years prior, and once in the corridor outside the estate office when he had asked her, with no preamble and no particular warmth, whether she intended to remain in the position once things changed. She had not known then what he meant. She had a clearer understanding. Now he smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting a long time and had arrived. The solicitor turned a page. No one heard the door to the hall open. The room was too large for that, the carpet too deep, and Mr. Ford D. Hartley had reached the section of the document concerned with the disposition of the late Baron's personal library, which was causing Miss Lavinia Carow, Gerald's eldest daughter, to release a small, aggrieved breath through her nose at intervals of roughly 30 seconds. What Miriam heard was the footman at the door making a sound that was not a word. She turned the man. In the doorway was not dressed for travel, which was the first wrong thing. He wore no overcoat. His coat was navy blue, fitted at the shoulder, and showed the road in its creases. His boots were dark with damp. His hair was auburn, close-cropped, now in a style that must have been military at some point, and his face was the face that was familiar in the way a thing is familiar when you have seen a painting of it and then met the original and found the painter had been too careful, too measured, not understanding that the original would be more uneven and more real. There was a thin scar cutting from the corner of his left eye toward his cheekbone. It was not in the painting. Miriam's breath left her at a speed that had nothing to do with the cold. Mr. Hartley had stopped speaking. "Forgive the interruption," the man in the doorway said. His voice was level. The slight roughness in it might have been the road or might have been something else entirely. "I was told the reading was at 10. Lady Constance's fan stopped moving entirely. He had turned in his chair. His face had gone through several expressions in the span of 3 seconds, settling finally on something that was not quite certainty, and not quite anything else a gentleman ought to feel in a room full of witnesses. "Matthew," he said. The word came out with a careful flatness that told Miriam he had chosen it to replace a word less. The man at the door, the man whose name was apparently Matthew, looked at him for precisely long enough that the room understood everything important, and then he looked at the solicitor. "Mr. Hartley," he said, "I imagine you will want to see the documentation before we continue." He was. Miriam understood. Matthew Carrow. He was the 6th Baron Ashwick. He was not dead, and no one in this room, except possibly Mr. Hartley, had known he was coming. If you find yourself wanting to know how a man survives a battle the War Office believed killed him, you're in exactly the company Miriam was in that November morning. Stay with it. So did she. Matthew Carrow had been reported dead at Badajoz in the spring of 1812, then living, then dead again, in the way of dispatches written in chaos and contradicted by later dispatches written in greater chaos. The letter that had reached Ashwick Hall had been definitive. The late Baron Ashwick, Matthew's father's cousin, the man who had held the estate in stewardship for the male line, had believed it, had mourned, appropriately rearranged certain documents, and begun the quiet, careful work of preparing the succession for Gerald. Matthew had been in a Spanish farmhouse for 8 months, not dead, but incapacitated by a wound to his side that had taken longer to close than wounds were supposed to take. Tended by a retired surgeon whose spoken English consisted almost entirely of anatomical vocabulary. By the time he was able to ride reliably, the war had moved, and Matthew had moved with what remained of his regiment, and the business of informing England that he was alive had become, for a time, less urgent than the business of surviving the next 6 months. He had arrived at Dover 4 days ago. None of this was known to the room at the time he walked through the door. All of it would be established, carefully, by the documentation Matthew laid before Mr. Vore. Hartley in the small study to the right of the drawing room, while the rest of the family remained in their chairs, and the fire in the grate sank lower, and no one touched the biscuits. Miriam knew about the study meeting because she was sent for. This, too, was irregular. Mrs. Peel was the logical choice, as the senior household staff present, and Miriam was the former secretary to a dead man and held no current position in the house. Mr. Tye, Hartley's clerk, had nevertheless put his head into the drawing room and asked if Miss Calder was present, using Miriam's name specifically, and Miriam had crossed the room with the distinct sensation of every eye in it following her. The study was warmer than the drawing room. Someone had maintained the fire in here. He stood at the desk, not behind it, and he was reading a letter when she came in. He looked up. It was the first time she had a full view of his face. The scar was more visible in this light, a pale seam from the outer edge of his left eye, and his eyes themselves were a dark amber closer to brown than gold, and they held the quality she was beginning to recognize as his particular stillness. He had the stillness of a man who had learned that movement costs you something, and had decided to spend it carefully. "You are Miss Calder," he said. Not a question. "Yes, my lord. My cousin Edmund spoke of you in his letters." He set the letter down on the desk. "He said you kept the estate correspondence in better order than any secretary before you, and that you understood the tenanted farms better than the steward did." Miriam did not say anything, because she did not know what the correct response to that was, and she had learned from 3 years of careful observation that saying nothing was almost always preferable to saying the wrong thing. "I want to know the state of the estate," Matthew said. "The actual state, not the version his cousin's man of business will be inclined to give me. Edmund trusted your accounting. I am inclined to trust his judgment." He paused. "Will you work with me on this?" The question was formal. It was also, Miriam understood with the clarity that came from 3 years of reading men who said one thing and meant another, a genuine question. He was not informing her. He was asking, "Yes, my lord," she said. He nodded once. He returned to the letter. The meeting, for all practical purposes, was concluded. Miriam walked back into the corridor with the slightly unsteady sensation of having agreed to something whose full dimensions she had not yet measured. The aftermath of the reading occupied the next 4 days in a way that left little room for measured thought. Mr. Hartley produced his documentation for the solicitor Gerald had sent for, who had arrived from Bath with impressive speed, suggesting Gerald had sent for him before the reading was concluded. The documents were the military dispatches, the medical attestations from the surgeon in Spain, Matthew's own correspondence during his recovery, and a letter from his commanding officer. The legal reality was not in serious doubt, though Gerald's solicitor raised several procedural questions that were, in Miriam's private assessment, exercises in delay rather than genuine inquiry. Gerald remained at Ashwick Hall. This was his right, technically, as the late Baron's cousin, while the estate's ownership was being formally established. Lady Constance remained because Ashwick Hall was her home, and no one, Matthew included, had suggested she should leave. The atmosphere of the house during those 4 days was the atmosphere of a room in which 2 conversations are happening simultaneously at different volumes, one of which everyone can hear, and one of which everyone pretends not to notice. Miriam worked. She had offered Matthew the estate ledgers the morning after the reading, and he had spent an hour with them, and at the end of that hour had asked her to sit down and explain the columns he did not understand. She had explained them. He had asked several questions that revealed a man who had been away for years, but had the kind of mind that, once shown a system, moved through it quickly. The tenanted farms interested him most. He asked about the Marin tenants by name, whether they were the same family as had held the farm when he was last at Ashwick, what the harvest had been, whether the cottage roof at Drenby Fields had been repaired. It had not been repaired, Miriam told him. She had written twice to the estate steward about the Drenby Fields cottage roof, and the matter had not been resolved. Matthew made a note. His handwriting was cramped and slightly irregular, the product, she supposed, of a man who had learned to write quickly in poor light. It was on the 2nd day, during a discussion of the Colwick tenancy accounts, that the door to the study opened without knocking. He stood in the doorway and looked at Matthew behind the desk and at Miriam in the chair to its left, and his expression did something complicated that resolved, as she watched, into something smooth and performative. "I hoped I might have a word with my cousin," Gerald said. The "my cousin" was deployed with a proprietorial ease, as though he were naming a thing he had owned for years, and was only now being asked to share. "You are welcome to return in an hour," Matthew said, without looking up from the ledger. "Miss Calder and I are in the middle of the Colwick accounts." Gerald looked at Miriam. She had felt this kind of look before, the kind that takes in a person and makes a quick calculation about their weight, their purpose, and their dispensability. She had felt it from him specifically, at least twice before this moment. "I should think," Gerald said, with a pleasant steadiness, "that a secretary can be set aside." "She is the estate's secretary," Matthew said, looking up at last, "not mine personally. If you have business about the estate, she should hear it. If you have personal business, return in an hour." Gerald returned in an hour. The meeting between the cousins lasted 40 minutes. Miriam was not present for it, but she passed the door of the study on her way to the housekeeper's sitting room and heard, very briefly, Gerald's voice at a register that was not his drawing-room register. Mrs. Peel, pouring tea in her sitting room with the deliberate calm of a woman who had survived the administration of 5 separate household crises before breakfast. He came, expecting to be the Baron. "Yes," Miriam said. "6 years of expecting will settle into a man," Mrs. Peel said. "Makes it hard to adjust the expectation." It was the most charitable framing Miriam had heard applied to him, and she thought about it for the remainder of the afternoon. He did not speak of his time in Spain, unless asked. When asked, it was specific and brief. The battle, the wound, the farmhouse, the surgeon, the months of recovery, the return to the regiment, the end of his service. He did not elaborate. He did not invite sympathy. He had the quality, Miriam observed, of a man who had put an experience into a box and fastened the lid and decided that the box would occupy its corner without being reopened unnecessarily. The scar was part of it, she suspected. Not vanity exactly. More the outward marking of a period he was not ready to relitigate in public. She asked him about it once by accident. They had been reviewing the correspondence file for the Marin tenancy, and she had reached across the desk for the second folder and misjudged the distance, and looked up and found his face very close, and the scar directly in her line of sight. And she had said, without entirely meaning to say it aloud, "Does it pain you still?" The pause that followed was long enough to make her regret the question. "Not as it did," Matthew said. He did not ask her what she meant. She did not explain. The moment closed, as moments in this house tended to close, without ceremony, and they returned to the Marin correspondence. That evening, in the particular quiet that settled over Ashwick Hall, between the dinner hour and the household's retirement, Miriam sat at the small writing table in her room and wrote a letter she did not send. It was a habit she had developed 3 years ago, the habit of writing to no one in particular as a way of understanding what she thought. She had filled 2 journals with these letters. She wrote the feeling of the study in the afternoon light. She wrote the specific quality of his stillness. She wrote in careful prose that admitted nothing directly, that she did not know what she was doing. She folded the letter and put it in the journal and put the journal in the locked drawer, and went to bed and did not sleep for quite some time. The crisis arrived. On the 5th day, in the form of Lady Constance. Miriam had expected something. Lady Constance's silence during the first 4 days had not been the silence of acceptance. It had been the silence of a woman sorting through her resources and selecting the most effective one. She arrived at the study door at 2 o'clock in the afternoon with Miss Lavinia Caro at her elbow, and a manner that was composed and affable, and to anyone who had observed her for 3 years entirely deliberate.
"My dear Matthew,"
she said, because she had known him as a child, and never quite relinquished the privilege of the Christian name. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment." Matthew set down his pen and rose. He was courteous to her. He was courteous, Miriam had noticed, to everyone in the household who occupied a position of vulnerability which was not the same as being warm, but was something. "Please sit down," he said. Lady Constance sat. She arranged her skirts and her fan and her expression. In that order, Miss Lavinia took the chair slightly behind her, which was either deference or strategic positioning, and Miriam had the strong impression it was the second. "I wanted to speak with you," Lady Constance said, "about the question of the house's administration." She paused. "I do not wish to be indelicate." Matthew waited. "A young woman," Lady Constance said, with the particular softness that preceded precision, "however capable, is a peculiar choice to oversee the correspondence and accounts of an estate that must present itself as properly ordered. Not because of anything in Miss Calder's character, of course." She allowed a pause which did most of the work she was nominally disclaiming. "But because of appearances. There are those in the county, Matthew, who would draw conclusions." "What conclusions precisely?" Matthew asked. Lady Constance smiled. The smile was patient. It was also a dismissal. "A bachelor's household," she said. "A secretary, who is not a man. The proximity of necessity." Another pause. "I only mention it because I know you have been away, and may not have had occasion to consider how these things are currently regarded." Miss Lavinia, who until this moment had been silent. "The Drenmore family has a very capable man of business who, I am told, is available." "He is available," Miriam said before she had quite decided to speak, "because he was released from the Drenmore position after he failed to correctly account for 3 seasons of wool income." The room went quiet. Miss Lavinia's expression shifted in a way that was not pleasant. "Miss Calder has a view on the county's business affairs," Lady Constance said, with a composure that was its own kind of reply. Miss Calder is correct, Matthew said. About the Drenmore accounting, I had the same information from Edmund's file. He looked at his aunt with a specific directness that was not unkind and was not accommodating. The arrangements in this house are as they are because they are effective. I have no intention of changing them for the sake of appearances. Lady Constance looked at him for a long moment. Then she rose, and Miss Lavinia rose a half-second behind her. Only think about it, Lady Constance, said. Her tone had not changed. This, Miriam had learned, was the more ominous version of her displeasure. The altered tone you could prepare for, the unchanged one meant she had already decided to proceed by other means. When they had gone, Matthew stood for a moment by the window. The afternoon light was thin and gray. The kitchen garden was visible below. Dormant now, the beds turned and bare. She is not wrong about appearances, Miriam said. She said it because it was true, and because she was not in the habit of letting true things go unsaid, to save herself the discomfort of saying them. Matthew turned from the window. I know, he said. He did not say anything further. He returned to his desk and picked up his pen. Miriam returned to the Colwick accounts. The fire shifted in the grate between them, and the afternoon continued. The drawing-room assembly took place on the 9th day. Miriam had not known it was planned. She had been in the estate office reviewing the November figures when Mrs. Peel appeared in the doorway to say that his lordship was asking for her in the drawing-room and that there were guests. The guests were Gerald's solicitor and 2 members of the county's minor gentry, whom Miriam recognized from the late Baron's correspondence as men Gerald had cultivated carefully over the preceding 2 years. Lady Constance was present, and Miss Lavinia, and Gerald himself, who stood by the mantelpiece with his particular expression of proprietorial ease. Matthew was not in the room. Gerald saw her enter. His expression arranged itself into something that was almost solicitous, which was the version of him she liked least. Miss Calder, he said. Good of you to join us. We were speaking about the future of Ashwick. Were you? Miriam said. The matter of the entail is not yet formally concluded, Gerald's solicitor said. He was a thin man with a very good coat, and the manner of someone whose professional utility depended on making uncertainty sound authoritative. There are procedural questions that Mr. Caro's counsel believes have not been adequately addressed. The questions, Miriam said, that were raised on the 3rd day and addressed in writing by Mr. Hartley on the 4th. Questions of that complexity, the solicitor said, are not resolved in a single document. I would be grateful, Gerald said, still pleasant, still measured, for a period of cooperation during which the matter can be properly sorted. The house's affairs need not be disrupted. What he meant, Miriam understood, was that the house's affairs and the estate secretary would be most useful to him if they continued to operate while the question of who properly held the estate was kept formally unsettled. It was a tidy position. It gave him the practical authority of the house without the legal designation. The documentation was conclusive, Miriam said, not combatively, as a statement of fact. Gerald looked at her. Something in his expression changed briefly, from pleasant to something else. A secretary, he said, is perhaps not best placed to judge questions of law. The dismissal of a secretary, Matthew said from the doorway behind her, is perhaps not a determination you are best placed to make. Miriam did not turn around. She had heard his footstep at the threshold, the particular quality of pause before he spoke, and she had thought, in the half-second before his voice arrived, he was behind her. He was there. Matthew crossed the room. He did not cross it quickly. He walked at the pace of a man who has decided something and has no particular need to demonstrate the decision through speed. He came to stand at Miriam's left, which put them side by side and facing Gerald and the solicitor together. And the room, adjusted to this arrangement, with a visible shift in its moral center of gravity. Gerald, Matthew said, I should tell you that Mr. Hartley arrived an hour ago with the formal instruments from the Lord Chancellor's office. The entail is confirmed and the succession is resolved. He looked at Gerald's solicitor. If your client has further questions of a procedural nature, I suggest he address them to his own counsel, who can take them up with Mr. Hartley's office. As a matter of law, Gerald's solicitor made a note on the paper in front of him. The gentry gentlemen exchanged a look. Lady Constance, who had been observing all of this from her chair with the attention of a woman updating a private calculation. Well, only that. Gerald said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Congratulations, cousin," with a pleasantness that was now simply a habit of his face, a form that no longer had anything behind it. "I will want the correspondence of the past 18 months, Matthew said. Whatever was directed to Ashwick, as if the succession were already Gerald's. Gerald's expression did not change. "Of course. Miss Calder will collect it," Matthew said. "She knows what is relevant." He looked at Miriam. The look lasted a second. In that second she saw something that she was not sure. Afterward, she had correctly identified. Something that was careful, and that was also underneath its carefulness decided. She went with Mrs. Peel that afternoon to gather the correspondence files that Gerald's man had maintained in the East Wing, and she worked through them for 2 hours, and she found several things that were clarifying, and she wrote them into the estate record in the careful, exact hand that 3 years of practice had given her. Gerald left Ashwick Hall on the 11th day. Lady Constance did not leave. She had not been asked to leave. Matthew had informed her, in the formal language of a man who does not enjoy administering necessary things but will administer them, that Ashwick was her home and would remain so for as long as she wished, and that the morning room and the East Suite were hers and would continue to be. Lady Constance had received this information with a graciousness that Miriam suspected cost her something, because real graciousness in Lady Constance was rarer and more expensive than the performed variety. Miss Lavinia had gone with her father. Miriam found the drawing-room on the afternoon of the 11th day measurably quieter. She was there when Matthew came in, which was unusual. She had been in the drawing-room to return a book she had borrowed from the library at the late Baron's invitation, a volume on agricultural management that she had not quite finished and had not been able to bring herself to set down. She replaced it on the shelf and turned. And Matthew was standing in the center of the room. He looked, she thought, slightly more tired than usual. The tension around his shoulders had the specific quality of relief settling in, which is different from relaxation and often more exhausting. "I thought you had gone for the evening," he said. "I was returning a book." He looked at the shelves. "Edmund's collection," he said. "He wrote to me about it. He said you were making your way through the agricultural volumes." He did not mind. He would not have. Matthew looked at the shelves for another moment, and Miriam watched the set of his face change, quietly, in the way it changed when something in the house recalled the specific absence of the man who had lived here. "He spoke of you often," he said. More than he perhaps realized. Miriam did not know what to say. She held the empty space where Edmund had been with the same careful attention she gave to most things, because grief, she had found, required attention rather than resolution. "He said," Matthew continued, still looking at the shelves, "that you were the most honest person he had met in 20 years of running this estate, that you told him things he needed to hear rather than things that were comfortable." He turned. He was not wrong about things of that kind. It was an admission. Miriam understood, wrapped in a comment about Edmund's judgment. The specific warmth of this came at her sideways before she had arranged her defenses properly, and she felt it in the very particular place where she felt things she had decided not to feel. "Edmund was generous," she said. "He was accurate," Matthew said. The fire had been banked for the evening, and was giving a low, amber warmth to the room. Outside, the November dark had come early, as it did in this part of England, and the windows held the reflection of the fire, rather than any view, Matthew said. "You told Lady Constance the truth about the Drenmore accounting." "Yes. Moat, ad, tap." "You did not look at me first to see whether I would back you." Miriam considered this. "No," she said. "It was a true thing. It did not require backing." Matthew was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is the thing Edmund meant." It was not, Miriam told herself later. In the room she returned to, and the journal she did not open, The kind of thing a man says to a woman he regards as a useful member of his household. It had the quality of something else. She was not certain she was entitled to notice that quality. She was not certain either that she had the discipline to stop noticing it. She spent the next several days doing what she had always done. She reviewed the correspondence. She attended the weekly discussion of estate affairs in the study, taking notes in the margin of the account books in her neat, exact hand. She rode with the steward to Drenby Fields because the roof repair had been authorized by Matthew the morning after his arrival, and she wanted to confirm the work had actually been ordered, and she stood in the cold outside the cottage while the steward explained the timeline, and she asked the questions Matthew would want answered. When she returned, Matthew was coming out of the stables, and they nearly collided at the gate. He put a hand out and caught her elbow before she could stumble backward, and the warmth of that contact through the wool of her coat was brief and specific and immediately withdrawn. "The roof," she said because something needed to be said. "It will be done by the 15th. I have the steward's confirmation in writing." "Good," Matthew said. He still had the quality of a man not quite finished stepping away from something. "Did you go to Drenby Fields yourself?" "I wanted to be sure, so did I," he said. He looked at her in the thin afternoon light, and he seemed for a moment to be deciding something. "You rode in this weather. It is only cold," Miriam said. "Not inclement. Something happened at the corner of his mouth." "Not a smile. Precisely. A consideration of one. Come in," he said. "Mrs. Peel will have something warm." It was, she recognized one of his commands, the ones that were protection in the syntax of instruction. She came in. There was a letter waiting for her on the hall table. She saw it as they entered. Her name in an unfamiliar hand, the seal of a London solicitor she did not know. She picked it up, and Matthew saw her do it, and said nothing, and she held it through the cup of tea Mrs. Shicken Peel brought, and through the quiet half-hour in the sitting-room where Matthew reviewed the steward's reports, and the fire managed finally to warm the room to something approaching comfort. She read the letter in her room that night. It was from the firm of Baxter and Hennessy, solicitors, on behalf of a Mr. Thomas Calder, her father's eldest brother, writing to inform her that her father had left, through the intestate succession of her late mother's modest estate, a sum of £400, which had remained in trust, pending her father's own death, and was now released to her. The uncle, who was apparently the trustee, wished to know her direction and her situation. £400 was not a fortune. It was not freedom, not quite. It was, however, choice. The specific, limited kind of choice that stood between one future and another. Miriam folded the letter. She sat at the window for a long time and did not write in her journal. The letter was not something she intended to mention. It was hers. The situation it described was hers. His lordship's household had no claim on the contents of her correspondence, and she had spent 3 years managing her situation without asking anyone to manage it for her, and she saw no reason to change this habit now. She told him the next morning. This surprised her. She had not planned to tell him. She had sat down at the desk in the estate office to begin the morning correspondence, and he had come in and set down his own correspondence, and looked at the account books for a moment, and then looked at her. And the specific quality of his looking at her had, apparently, produced in her the strong, involuntary requirement to say something truthful. She told him about the letter, about the £400, about the uncle in London. Matthew listened without interrupting. This was his consistent practice, and she had grown accustomed to it, the full weight of his attention without the interference of commentary. When she finished, he said, "What are you going to do?" "I do not know yet," she said. Which was, honest, he was quiet for a moment. "Is it your intention to leave?" She looked up. He was not looking at the account books. He was looking at her with the specific directness he brought to things he actually wanted to know, rather than things he was asking as a courtesy. "I had not decided," she said. Another pause. The morning light through the study window was pale and clean. The first December light, harder and clearer than November's. "I would prefer," Matthew said, "that you did not." It was the most direct thing he had said to her that was not about the estate. Miriam looked at him for a moment, then she said, "That is a preference about the estate's administration." "No," Matthew said. "It is not." The silence that followed this was of a different quality than the silences she had grown accustomed to. It had weight. It had direction. "My lord," she said carefully. "Matthew," he said. "I think by now, Matthew." She said it for the first time. It sat differently in her mouth than she had expected. "You understand what you are saying. I understand it very clearly." Outside, in the kitchen garden, one of the stable boys was carrying a bucket across the yard. The sound of it was clear and ordinary in the cold morning air. A coal shifted in the grate. Miriam said, "Lady Constance will have a view." "Lady Constance," Matthew said, "has views about most things and will continue to have them. I do not think it should govern what we decide." She noticed the "we." "You have been here 11 days, she said. Not as an argument. As information. "I have known you through Edmund's letters for 3 years, he said. "I came home expecting to find a capable administrator. I found that and considerably more besides." He looked at her steadily. "I am not a man who acts on insufficient information." "I have sufficient information." The bluntness of this was, she thought, exactly the quality the drawing room did not know how to account for. The quality of a man who had spent years in circumstances where imprecision cost lives, who had come home and found no particular reason to practice it. She said, "I am not a wealthy woman." "I know what you are," Matthew said. Edmund was very thorough. Something that was not quite a laugh arrived at the edges of her composure, and she kept it carefully there. "I have no particular gift for social performance," she said. "I say true things at inconvenient moments, Miss Calder," he said, with a patience that was almost gentle. "I am asking you to marry me, not to improve." The specific plainness of this arrived somewhere below her careful defenses, and settled there. "Yes," she said. Matthew was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." He picked up his pen. He returned to the correspondence. Miriam returned to the account books. The fire maintained itself reliably in the grate. Outside, the December morning continued in its pale, clean way, indifferent to the fact that something had been decided. It was 3 days before Lady Constance found out. She found out because Matthew told her he had not, Miriam suspected, told her for the particular reason of softening the revelation or managing her response. He had told her because it was the correct thing to do, and he intended to do correct things in their correct order. He requested a meeting with his aunt in the morning room and informed her that he intended to marry Miss Calder, the estate secretary, by special license before Christmas. Miriam heard about this meeting from Mrs. Say. Peel, who had heard it through the natural mechanisms of a house in which sound traveled more freely than anyone acknowledged. Lady Constance had been silent for a long moment after Matthew's announcement, Mrs. Peel reported. Then she had said, "She is not suitable." Matthew had said, "She is exactly suitable. She is a secretary," Lady Constance had said. "She is the woman I am going to marry," Matthew had said. "I would prefer your blessing." "I do not require it." This exchange, as Mrs. Peel recounted it, had a quality that Miriam could hear clearly, because she knew both voices, and she knew exactly how both of them sounded when they had decided something. The blessing did not come immediately. What came first was that Gerald, who had apparently kept a correspondent in the county, received word of the intended marriage and sent a letter to the county's most active social arbiter, who hosted a dinner at which the subject was discussed, and the consensus was that Ashwick had apparently gone eccentric in Spain, and that the woman was a nobody with £400 and no family to speak of. This opinion, in the way of such opinions, made its way back to Ashwick Hall in the form of an invitation that pointedly excluded Miss Calder, addressed only to Lord Ashwick. Matthew wrote a brief reply, declining the invitation. He did not explain himself. The following Sunday, he attended church in the village with Miriam at his side, which was the oldest and most unambiguous language available to a man of his position, and the village understood it, And the county, hearing about it, understood it too, and made the adjustments that were made when a man of sufficient rank made a choice and appeared to mean it. Lady Constance came to Miriam's sitting room on Tuesday afternoon. 1. Hand. Miriam received her in the small chair by the window, because the fire in her sitting room was not as well maintained as the one in the morning room, and there was a practical matter in the draught from the window she had been meaning to report to the housekeeper. She offered tea. Lady Constance sat. "I want you to understand," Lady Constance said, "that I do not oppose you personally." Miriam waited. "I oppose the irregularity," Lady Constance said. "A man of Matthew's position requires a wife who can manage the social responsibilities of the estate. Balls, calls, the season, when they are in London." She paused. "I do not know whether you have the preparation for it." "I managed Lord Ashwick's correspondence," Miriam said, "including the social correspondence, the invitations, and the responses, for 3 years. Managing correspondence is not the same as managing a room." "No," Miriam said. "It is considerably more complicated." Lady Constance looked at her for a long moment. Then, very slightly, something in her expression changed. It was not warmth, precisely. It was the specific change that happens in a face when a person has encountered something they had not expected and are revising their estimate accordingly. "You are very direct," Lady Constance said. "Yes," Miriam said. "I have found it is generally the most efficient approach." Another pause. Lady Constance set down her teacup. "Edmund liked you," she said. It was not a concession. It was a fact being admitted. "I liked him," Miriam said. "He was not a fool," Lady Constance said, "about people. He was sometimes a fool about money, and occasionally a fool about horses, but not about people." "No, Miriam." Agreed, Lady Constance stood. She straightened her gloves, which was a habit of hers, the specific precision of a woman who had been reordering her small domain for 6 decades as a way of managing the larger domain she could not control. "I shall need," she said, "to think about what arrangement of the morning room is most suitable for the new mistress." She left, without further ceremony. Miriam sat in the draught from the window for a moment and did not entirely trust the feeling that was in her chest. They were married on the 17th of December by the vicar of the parish church, with Mrs. Peel and the vicar's wife as witnesses, and a thin snow that had begun the night before still drifting, without commitment, across the churchyard stones. Matthew's hand, when it met hers at the altar, was warm and steady, and the ring was his grandmother's, which Lady Constance had produced from the morning-room strong-box 2 days prior, with only the observation that the size would likely require adjustment. It did not require adjustment. Afterward, walking back across the churchyard in the snow that had not yet decided whether it intended to mean anything, Matthew stopped at a particular stone. It was the stone for his father, who had died when Matthew was 14. Miriam stood beside him and did not speak, because some things required silence rather than comment, and she had learned, by now, the difference. He had kept a miniature of his father in the breast pocket of his coat throughout the weeks at Ashwick. She had noticed this when he reached for his pen one afternoon, and the shape of it pressed briefly through the wool. She had not asked about it. She had understood it, as the anchor it was the small carried thing that told him where home was when he had been too long away. He touched the stone with 2 fingers. Then he looked at her, and the snow was very light on his shoulders and in his hair, and his dark amber eyes had the quality they had when he had decided something and was at peace with the deciding. "Come in," he said. It was the command she knew now, the one that meant he was behind her, the one that meant home. She came in. They walked back across the churchyard and through the gate and up the path toward the hall, which was lit in its windows against the December afternoon, and the smoke from the kitchen chimney rose in a white column against the pale gray sky. And through the drawing-room window Miriam could see the fire that had, at last, been properly tended. She had moved into the room that had not been hers until this morning, and in the drawer of the writing table by the window she had placed the journal, the letters written to no one, the record of the preceding weeks. She did not need to reread them to know what they said. She knew because she had written them, and because the things she had written in them had arrived, quietly and without fanfare, exactly as they were. The hall door opened to receive them. Inside, Mrs. Peel had arranged for a small dinner, and in the morning room where the fire was excellent, Lady Constance was already seated, and the table was set for 3. Matthew held the door. In the journal in the drawer, in a letter written to no one 3 weeks ago, there was a line that Miriam had written without knowing quite why, recording that in this house she had the first time in years understood what it meant to be in the place you were supposed to be. She had thought it was about the work, the correspondence and the ledgers, and the particular satisfaction of a well-maintained account. She understood now that it had not been only about the work. The fire in the morning room was warm and steady. The snow outside had decided finally that it meant something after all. And through the window, the stone of the churchyard was white and still, and the miniature in Matthew's breast pocket was where it had always been, carried carefully home. If the quiet dignity of a thing fully earned has ever moved you, leave a word below. And thank you, truly, for staying to the end.